U.S. Cold War aircraft carriers Forrestal, Kitty Hawk and Enterprise classes for introduction. The Forrestal-class aircraft carriers were the world's first true supercarriers and served in the United States Navy for the majority of America's Cold War with Soviet Union. Emerging on the scene in the early 1950s, the Forrestal-class carriers and the subsequent Kitty Hawk class represented a notable departure from prior carrier designs and were the first carriers capable of launching large-scale strategic jet airstrikes against land-based targets, while simultaneously retaining enough organic air power to protect the carrier from incoming enemy airstrikes. The Forrestal-class supercarriers introduced four powerful steam catapults for large elevators for moving aircraft quickly between the hangar bay and flight deck, an armored angled deck for improved air operations, and the mirror optics landing aid. The larger flight deck also soloed operation of more aircraft with a wider variety of missions. The Kitty Hawk class, a variation of the initial Forrestal design, featured a reconfigured flight deck that significantly enhanced air operations. Notably, the port elevator was moved aft of the angled deck runway and the starboard island was moved to the rear, with elevators 1 and 2 now forward of the island. Defensive guns were also removed and replaced by new surface-to-air missile systems. This new configuration would go on to form the basic flight deck arrangement of not only Enterprise, but also of the future Nimitz and Gerald Ford-class carriers. The Forrestal class and the improved Kitty Hawk class, together with the single-ship class USS John F. Kennedy and USS Enterprise, the latter the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, constituted a large part of the United States Navy carrier forces throughout the Cold War, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, and the high-tension 1970s and 1980s. Collectively, these carriers made 33 deployments to Vietnam, forming the heart of the heavy carrier strike forces. Indeed, only USS John F. Kennedy did not serve in Vietnam. During these times, the United States operated as many as 15 large deck attack aircraft carriers, each forming the nucleus of a powerful carrier battle group. These carriers provided a strong American presence in foreign waters, responded to countless crises, and ensured that vital sea lanes were kept open to supply Western Europe and NATO in the event of open war with Soviet Union. Moreover, several of these great carriers continued to serve after the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the end of the Cold War. 5 supporting air operations in Bosnia and Kosovo during the 1990s. Operation Southern Watch and Desert Fox in Iraq, and operations in Afghanistan and Iraq during the 2000s. This work discusses the development of these Cold War titans and provides an overview of the operational impact each carrier made on the Cold War effort. As a testament to the soundness of its design, the General Forrestal-class carriers weathered 54 years. The first, USS Forrestal CV-59, was commissioned in October 1955, and the last, USS Kitty Hawk CV-63, an improved Forrestal design, was decommissioned in 2009. USS Enterprise CV-65, christened in 1960, was the last of these great Cold War carriers, serving proudly for 51 years until its deactivation in late 2012. Origins of the carrier and the supercarrier. Although interest in ship-based aviation surfaced in the late 1890s via Samuel Langley's proposed aerodrome flying machine, naval aviation in the United States did not take hold until the early 1910s. On November 14, 1910, Curtiss Aircraft's chief test pilot Eugene Ely made the first takeoff from a ship, launching a Curtiss pusher from a modified wooden deck affixed to the scout cruiser USS Birmingham CL-2, which was anchored in Hampton Roads, Virginia. 2 months later, on January 18, 1911, Ely landed his Curtiss aircraft on a 127 by 32 feet wooden platform-mounted tow deck of the armored cruiser USS Pennsylvania CA-4 anchored in San Francisco Bay, marking the first use of a tailhook landing system. Despite attention raised by Ely's efforts, the Navy turned its focus to float and seaplanes, which dominated the fleet until the late 1910s, when developments in British carrier aviation, namely the flush-deck HMS Argus, forced the United States to take a closer look at the concept of an aircraft carrier. With the success of aircraft versus ship actions in World War I, and the obvious benefits of using aircraft for scouting and gunnery spotting, the US Navy began studying the expanded use of aviation in naval operations. As a result, in 1918 the Navy outlined requirements for an aircraft carrier and, in April 1919, Congress made funds available for the conversion of a Slocalier, USS Jupiter AC-3, into an experimental carrier. Jupiter was renamed Langley in honor of aviation pioneer Samuel Langley and redesignated as CV-1. Conversion work began in March 1920 and the carrier was recommissioned in March 20, 1922. On a larger front, in July 1920 the Navy announced a 3-year carrier building program that called forth construction of 4 dedicated aircraft carriers. This plan was reduced to 3 carriers a year later, but Congress refused to set aside funding. Langley was a flush-deck carrier displacing 12,700 long tons and featuring a 542 feet 165.2 meters long flight deck measuring 65 feet 5 inches 19.9 meters abeam. The carrier featured a single catapult later removed and 1 elevator, and could operate roughly 36 aircraft. Underpowered for a carrier, the ship could only muster 15.5 knots 17.8 miles per hour, meaning it could not effectively operate with capital ships. Langley was an experimental aircraft carrier and operated as such until it was redesignated as a seaplane tender in 1936. Langley was instrumental in pilot training, experimental work, and tactical development in the mid-1920s. Langley was joined in service by USS Lexington CV-2 and Saratoga CV-3 in late 1927, both of which were converted from battlecruiser hulls, due to the tonnage limitations imposed by the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty. The 2 Lexington-class carriers were the largest of their day, boasting the displacement of over 36,000 long tons and carrying up to 80 aircraft on their nearly 900 feet flight decks. Both carriers were fast over 33 knots at 38 miles per hour and well protected by armor. The 14,576 long-ton USS Ranger CV-4 entered service in 1934, but at 769 feet 234.4 meters overall length was considerably smaller than its 2 predecessors. Despite being the first aircraft carrier built as a carrier from its conception, Ranger proved too small and slow for Pacific operations and was relegated to anti-submarine duty in the Atlantic during the war, where it flew strikes against North Africa and Norway. Ranger was followed by the larger 19,800 long-ton Yorktown class, which consisted of the class namesake CV-5, USS Enterprise CV-6, and US Hornet CV-8. Yorktown class carriers possessed 3 elevators and could carry as many as 90 aircraft. These carriers were heavily armed with 8 single-mount Mk-12 5 inches of 38 caliber guns, for quad 1.1 inches of 75 caliber guns, and 24.50 caliber machine guns. A final pre-war carrier, USS Wasp CV-7, joined the fleet in 1940. Wasp displaced roughly 14,700 long tons and had a flight deck length 741 feet 225.93 meters, even shorter than that of Ranger. As 1930s progressed, the U.S. Navy possessed 7 aircraft carriers, each with a dedicated air group of fighters, dive bombers, scouting aircraft, and torpedo bombers. Langley had by then been relegated to seaplane tender duties. The carriers and their attached air group had come a long way since the pre-Langley days of scouting and target spotting, and now possessed a considerable offensive punch against surface forces. 7 World War II careers. World War II in the Pacific opened on December 7, 1941, with a prime demonstration of what concentrated carrier-based air power could accomplish if used decisively. The 6 carrier strike by Japanese Naval Air Force's Kido Butai on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor proved an astounding success. 8 U.S. battleships sunk, grounded, or damaged, and at once signaled the end of the battleship's reign as Queen of the Seas. Although not fully appreciated at the time by the Japanese, who for many years after Pearl Harbor continued to advocate a large, open ocean battleship encounter in the spirit of Alfred Their, the Americans, whose battleships were now out of action, recognized the full potential of carrier air power and immediately made carrier operations the centerpiece of their campaign to retake the Pacific. Key to this carrier force was the Essex-class carrier, of which 36 were ordered and 24 were built. First commissioned in December 1942. The Essex-class carriers displaced 27,100 long tons and had flight decks measuring 860 feet 260.7 meters for the short-hull version, or 840 feet 257.3 meters for the unconstrained by the Naval treaty limitations. Each carrier could operate between 90 and 100 aircraft and reflected years of pre-war aviation experience. By war's end, the United States' immense carrier fleet had turned the tide against the Japanese, sinking all 6 of the Imperial Japanese Navy carriers involved in the 1941 Pearl Harbor attack and destroying the remainder of Japanese carrier fleet. Moreover, American carriers had provided vital close air support for amphibious operations during Admiral Chester Nimitz's island-hopping campaign in the Central Pacific and the efforts to retake the Philippines. Post-World War II carrier developments following the war, the once formidable United States Navy carrier force was immediately slashed from over 99 aircraft carriers, including 17 of the Essex-class fleet carriers, to fewer than 20 carriers by 1948, including the 3 new 45,000 long-ton Midway-class carriers, USS Midway CVB-41, USS Franklin D. Roosevelt CVB-42, and USS Coral Sea CVB-43, possessing a flight deck of 970 feet 296 meters. Each carrier could operate up to 130 aircraft off the air. Midway was commissioned in late 1945, and its sisters followed in October 1945 Franklin D. Roosevelt, and October 1947 Coral Sea. The 3 additional Midway-class carriers under contract CVB-44, 56, and 57 were cancelled. While the Navy struggled to determine its proper post-war carrier force structure, other factors were being introduced that would significantly impact not only carrier procurement, but also carrier design. Budgetary constraints were limiting the overall size of the U.S. military, forcing the services, especially the Navy and the newly formed Air Force, to compete for funding. Jet aircraft were now joining the fleet in large numbers and were proving difficult to operate on the smaller Essex-class carriers without major modifications to the ships. Due to their slow engine spool time, jet aircraft needed a longer takeoff distance or at least assistance from catapults. Likewise, the faster approach speed also meant that the jet aircraft needed more room to land and heavier resting gear. Jet aircraft also burn more fuel, which necessitate more storage on the carrier for jet fuel. Moreover, there was concern over the added weight of the new aircraft and the wear and tear on the wooden flight decks. For these reasons, Essex-class carriers were too small. Lastly, nuclear weapons meant that the Navy needed larger bombers to hurl atomic weapons over long distances for strikes against enemy mainland targets. These bombers would, by design, be much heavier than aircraft of day. A partial solution to that problem was an aggressive Essex-class carrier modernization program, referred to as Project to 7A. This effort involved strengthening the flight deck to accommodate aircraft up to 40,000 pounds, installing hydraulic catapults, removing the twin 5 inches of .38 caliber gun mounts to provide more deck space, increasing elevator strength, increasing aviation fuel, and installing jet blast deflectors behind the catapults. Project to 7A modifications began on USS Oriskany CV-34, an Essex-class carrier still under construction at the end of the war, and conversion was completed in September 1950. Oriskany was the first of 9 such Project to 7A Essex modifications. Plans were also being evaluated to modify the larger Midway-class carriers, and others studied the concept of a Midway follow-on. The operation of jet bombers presented an even more significant problem for the carriers than those surrounding jet fighters. At the time, the Navy was pursuing several heavy jet bomber designs in the 100,000 pounds range, which were too large for even the Midway-class carriers. It was envisioned that these new bombers would carry atomic weapons, thereby providing the Navy with a strategic asset to complement its already proven tactical mission. Given these constraints, the obvious solution was a new class of aircraft carrier. Despite the impending budgetary woes, work began in early 1946 on a new carrier design initially termed the CVBX that would specifically be able to operate the heavy jet bombers, which were anticipated to enter service in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The end product of these efforts was the Navy Ship Characteristic Board SCB Design 6A, later named United States CV-58. United States CV-58 USS United States represented a quantum leap forward in capability and was the first aircraft carrier designed from its outset to operate jet-powered aircraft. With an overall length of 1,090 feet 330.2 meters and a molded beam of 130 feet 39.6 meters, United States would weigh over 65 OOT, making it the largest warship of its time. The carrier was to feature 4 catapults, 2 on the bow and 1 on each side of the flight deck, capable of operating the new heavy jet bombers. The carrier featured a flush deck to provide as much operational space as possible for the aircraft. The island structure would be raised and lowered using an elevator, allowing it to be lowered flush with the flight deck during air operations, thus providing an obstruction-free deck. 4 deck elevators were available for moving aircraft between the hangar and flight. USS Ranger was one of the most celebrated of the forestal carriers and was featured, or at least seen in a number of movies including Top Gun, Star Trek IV, and The Final Countdown. Ranger was the only forestal-class carrier to retain its original gun sponsons, although the 5-inch mounts were removed and replaced by surface-to-air missiles. The carrier made several Vietnam deployments and participated in Operation Desert Storm Deck. The total carrier air group was estimated at 12 to 18 heavy bombers, each with a 2,000-mile range, and approximately 50 for jet fighters. Some sources report as many as 80. Defensive armament included 8 single-mount Mk-12 5 inches of 38 caliber guns, 16 76mm A-70 caliber guns in twin mounts, and 20 Oerlikon 20 mm cannons. Power was to be provided by 8 200 Psi 8.3 megapascals Foster Wheeler boilers and 4 Westinghouse steam turbines, generating 280,000 St. Helena pounds to 109 megawatts for a top speed of over 33 knots. As a reflection of its immense size and capabilities, United States was aptly referred to as a supercarrier. As the Navy pressed forward with its carrier design, a long-standing feud intensified between the Navy and the Air Force as to each service's respective mission. The Air Force, which at the time was focusing on strategic atomic bombing, had proposed a large fleet of heavy bombers 70 air groups basé dans the Convair B-36 Peacemaker, which had entered service in August 1946. Concerned the Navy's supercarriers and their carrier-based long-range bombers would encroach on their strategic bombing mission, the Air Force vehemently opposed the construction of United States and the Navy's jet bombers. The Navy, while on one hand wanting an organic atomic capability, nevertheless saw the nuclear mission as a supplement to, rather than a replacement for, the Air Force's strategic bombing role. With its success in World War II, the Navy wanted a carrier design that could enhance its tactical strike capabilities developed during the war and provide force control and the support of amphibious operations. Given the limited funding available after the war and the massive time demobilization underway, the U.S. military could not afford to pursue a carrier fleet based around the $189 million supercarriers while at the same time purchasing the proposed 100 B-36 strategic bomber. According to the Navy, based on its experiences in the Pacific theater during World War II, Air Force bombers would be of limited value against Soviet air defenses, and flexible supercarrier battle groups offered the most cost-efficient means of striking Soviet targets. The Navy obtained approval for the first of 4 new supercarriers on July 29, 1948, when President Harry S. Truman signed the Naval Appropriations Act of 1949. The supercarriers were to operate in 4 carrier task forces, each centered on a United States-class supercarrier, with a Midway-class carrier in 3 of the task forces and 2 Essex-class carriers in the remaining task force. The bulk of the anti-submarine and fighter protection would be provided by the smaller carriers. As of 1948, Navy plans called for each of these supercarriers to be constructed in successive years' fiscal year, FY49 to FY52, with all operational by 1955. Construction of the keel began on April 18, 1949, at Newport News Shipyard in Virginia. However, Truman's Secretary of Defense, Lewis Johnson, who sided with the Air Force and Army's strategic viewpoint, abruptly consulted United States just 5 days later on April 23, without consulting the Secretary of the Navy or the Chief of Naval Operations. Johnson felt the supercarrier and its aircraft would be redundant for the Air Force's strategic bombing mission. Johnson also reduced the carrier fleet from 8 to 4 Essex-class carriers, 3 Midway-class carriers, and air groups reduced it from 14 to 6. As a consolation for these reductions and cuts, the Navy was authorized to pursue improvements to the Midway class, to modernize the wartime Essex carriers, and to deploy the J-1 Savage and the 70 all jet-powered heavy bomber, which became the 3 Sky Warrior. Even though United States was never built, it nevertheless played a vital role in shaping the design of future carriers. Indeed, it served as the starting point for construction of what would become one of the most significant aircraft carrier designs, the Forrestal class. Despite cancellation of United States Navy planners continued working on the design and exploring potential improvements, including those of the steam-powered catapult and angled flight deck, which were being evaluated by the Royal Navy. Despite the obvious deficiencies in carriers of the day, a strong interest in expanding carrier force did not surface until the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950. When hostilities began, American, British, and Australian carriers were the only air forces capable of providing tactical resistance to the North Korean onslaught. By the war's end, the carrier had again established itself as an effective means to project air power, in particular tactical air power against land-based targets. In all, 12 American carriers participated in the Korean War, operating a mix of propeller AD-1 through AD-4 Skyraiders and F-4U Corsair and Jet F-9F Panther and F-2H Banshee aircraft. Task Force 77's carriers operating from the Sea of Japan flew over 255,000 sorties. With the lessons of the Korean War and the shortfalls of the then carrier fleet composition fresh at hand, the Navy once again pushed for development of a new class of carriers. What resulted was a scaled-down version of the cancelled United States. Named in honor of the first U.S. Secretary of Defense and former World War I naval aviator James Vincent Forrestal, the new carrier displaced 59,000 t and measured 1,039 feet 316.6 meters long by 129.5 feet 39.4 meters abeam. The flight deck incorporated several key British innovations, including the armored, angled flight deck, steam catapults, and the Mirrorlands landing system. Forrestal represented a multi-generational leap forward in aircraft carrier design over any carrier of the day and was so successful that it formed the basis for all subsequent U.S. Navy carrier designs. The Forrestal class, even with the cancellation of United States, many in the Navy continued to push for a new carrier design. In August 1949, for example, OP-55, the studies arm of the Deputy C&O Air, proposed a flush deck variant of the Midway class or, at a minimum, conversion of some of the Essex-class carriers to a flush deck configuration. Here, the belief was that long-range bomber aircraft could not successfully be launched from a carrier with a fixed island structure. Hopes were raised in 1950 as Representative Carl Vincent de Gaulle, Congress' most outspoken advocate of the Navy, let it be known that Congress would likely back a new carrier, albeit one considerably smaller than United States. Vincent suggested a 60,000 trillion outer limit be placed on any design. Vincent's suggestion was met with receptive ears. Since the cancellation of United States, studies had been underway at the Bureau of Ships Bishops to determine what trade-offs could be made to reduce the overall size of a new carrier. These studies used United States as a starting point and incorporated other concepts from previously discarded designs. Moreover, these studies reflected the shift in mission thinking since 1946, which had seen the Navy move from strategic strikes by a small number of large bomber aircraft, as portended by United States, to more traditional tactical air strikes mounted by a large number of smaller aircraft, which was akin to car usage in the Pacific. This shift was also facilitated by the successful miniation of atomic weapons, which made possible delivery by fighter-sized aircraft. As mentioned before, the real motivating factor behind the development and acquisition of Forrestal was the outbreak of the Korean War on June 22, 1950. At the time, the sole U.S. Navy Pacific Fleet carrier able to respond was Essex-class carrier USS Valley Forge CV-45. Strikes from the carrier began in earnest on July 3 and helped slow the North Korean advance by providing air cover to retreating ground forces. On July 11, the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended postponing any further discussion of reductions in carrier force levels and, the following day, SecDef Johnson agreed to authorize a new carrier construction. By October 28, 1950, a revised FY50 construction program was rendered, which included a new carrier SCB-80, along with various SCB-7 conversions and modifications to the midways. The request was approved by Navy Secretary Francis P. Matthews 2 days later, and the Navy was officially on track for construction of the first new carrier class since the midways of the mid-1940s. Commencing with FY52, a new carrier was to be constructed each year. Indeed, authorization was given for 6 large carriers running through FY57. Although force levels were not set at that time, in part due to the need to replace so many carriers from the World War II era, the Navy would by August 1953 settle on a force level of 15 attack carriers, of which the new Forrestal class would be the centerpiece. Given the SECDEV's approval and willingness of both Congress and Secretary Johnson to support carrier construction, Buships immediately began modifying its carrier plans, which it had been touting since midsummer. The plans called for an all-weather carrier with an enclosed bow and a flush deck design similar to United States. A number of studies were conducted and completed by early 1951, and a contract was signed on July 12 for construction by Newport News Shipbuilding. Congress authorized the contract on July 30 and released a joint resolution stating that the carrier, now designated as CV-59, would be named Forrestal. Forrestal's design went through a number of modifications during its development phase, with consideration given to removal of one of the 4 elevators, reducing armaments, reducing armor protection, and proper aviation fuel and ordnance requirements. In the end, the 4-deck elevator configuration was adopted, providing a dedicated elevator for each catapult. Moreover, the hangar bay was set at 25 feet 7.62 meters the height sufficient to allow storage of the new jets in production, such as the 3D, which required 20 feet 6.7 meters of headroom. As designed, the carrier featured 4 hydraulic H-9 catapults, a retractable island bridge structure, and side-mounted smokestacks. The catapults were quick-clear-placed with a slotted tube actuated by an explosive powder charge. These new catapults, designated as C7 and the lighter 10, provided tremendous savings in space and weight. By 1953, while the carrier was well under construction, the powder-driven catapult system was replaced by a new version of the heavy C7 and a new C11, which was based on the British BXS-1 steam catapult system tested aboard HMS Perseus in August 1950. This system was later tested by the USA between December 1951 and February 1952. The retractable island was itself the subject of some debate, with many aviators calling for a return to the flush deck designs of Langley, Ringer, and United States. When construction began, a retractable island was to be located at the forward starboard side of the flight deck, just ahead of the starboard catapult. Even so, a contingency was incorporated that permitted installation of a permanent island structure between the aft starboard catapult and starboard elevator, if operations deemed it necessary. To reduce possible smoke on the flight deck during air operations, exhaust from the engines was vented using a crossover system to stacks on each side of the carrier that could be folded down horizontally during air operations. The original plan specified for stacks on each side, which were expensive and space-consuming. As the design moved forward, the hull was redesigned, giving the ship a conventional underbody and transom stern in place of the twin skids configuration inherent in the United States design. This modification enhances the waterline length from 980 to 990 feet, but improved survivability, since the inner and outer drive shafts would be further separated, making propulsion more resistant to torpedo damage. A third rudder was also added to improve survivability. Perhaps the most significant modification to the original design came in October 1953, when authorization was given to incorporate the angled deck arrangement. As designed, Forrestal was a conventional or axial deck carrier, which meant that aircraft landing traveled down the carrier's center line and were stopped by either the resting wires hopefully or T safety barricade. If the barricade failed, the landing aircraft would crash into the parked aircraft, which had been relocated to the carrier's bow for recovery operations. The angled deck enabled the carrier to conduct both launch and recovery operations and to prevent landing accidents associated with a barricade miss. With the angled deck configuration, the landing zone of the carrier was canted to port and away from the island structure and bow of the ship. If an aircraft missed a wire during recovery, the aircraft could simply apply power bolter and take off for a second attempt. The British had been working on the angled deck concept since August 1951. Early tests were performed on HMS Triumph, a light carrier that had a 10-degree angled landing area painted on for touch-and-go 14 landings. The U.S. Navy performed similar tests aboard USS Midway and in 1950 modified USS Antietam CV-36 with a port sponson and angled deck. The results were spectacular and plans were made to incorporate the design into the FY-55 carrier, which would become USS Independence CV-62. Angled decks were also authorized for a select number of modified Essex-class carriers SCB-7C and the Midway's SCB-110. Even though Forrestal, and by now Saratoga, were already under construction, the CN authorized the entire Forrestal class to be fitted with the new angled deck, as well as a conventional island structure. This, of course, necessitated a redesign of the flight deck layout and meant moving the aft port elevators to starboard. The island was then located amidship with one elevator forward and two aft of the island. The redesign also meant relocating starboard fighter catapult C-11 to port on the sponson now cantilever, which prevented simultaneous launch from the waist catapults. This redesign made USS Ranger CV-61 the first U.S. Navy carrier built from the start as an angled deck carrier. Other modifications to the original Forrestal design saw a reduction from 4 to 3 hangar bays, each with elevator service from the starboard side. The new angled deck, while providing all of the advantages previously noted, also meant that fewer cross-deck pendants or wires were required for landing aircraft, which in turn meant fewer resting gear engines and more free internal space. The carrier deck reconfiguration also provided benefits in electronics and engine exhaust, yielding even more space. Placing the radar and communications antennas on the higher island structure not only provided greater functionality for the equipment, but also eliminated redundant radars and the associated wiring. Moreover, the removal of the original uptakes exhausts and use of an island stack saved much-needed space. As many as 10 Forrestal-class carriers were planned, however, funding was only made available for the first 6, FY-52 through FY-57. And the Navy's request for another in the FY-60 program was rejected. FY-58 represented USS Enterprise, and no carrier was authorized for FY-59. Forrestal has built carrier structures. The Forrestal-class carriers represented the largest warships to date, displacing 59,650 long tons empty and nearly 79,000 t with a full load. The carrier was smaller than United States but nonetheless much larger than Midway. Overall size measured was 990 feet 301.7 meters long and 129.6 feet 39.5 meters abeam at the waterline. The draft was 36 feet 10.9 meters. The carrier's displacement grew over the years and ultimately reached 83 OOT by its retirement, resulting in an additional foot of draft. From top to bottom, Forrestal stood at nearly 25 stories. Forrestal featured a fixed island superstructure with 2 bridges, one above the other, at the forward end of the superstructure. The top level served as the navigation bridge, and the lower served as the flag bridge. A navigation bridge extended further aft and featured a small auxiliary reckoning station on its starboard side. The windows on both bridges were 15-canted, allowing a better field of view onto the carrier's deck. Carrier operations were monitored from primary flight control Pryfly located at the aft end of the island. Pryfly was L-shaped, running along the port and stern of the island. Pryfly controlled their operations around the carrier, from entry into the pattern until handoff to the landing signal officer LSO, who actually brought their craft aboard. A small enclosed housing contained a television monitoring system used to record carrier landings. The pilot landing aid televisions, also called PLAT, could be viewed from the squadron-ready rooms. The carrier had a crew of roughly 4,500, including 2,750 officers and enlisted, and an air group of 2,150. Of the aircrew, these were divided into squadrons and included officers, enlisted personnel, and further air group staff. Commanding the carrier was a captain. The air group later or wing was commanded by a commander and later a captain, who surveyed as commander, air group, or CAG. Carrier operations around the ship were overseen by the air boss, who usually held the rank of commander. The flight deck and hangar bay Forrestal's flight deck, measuring 10,309,252 feet 316.6 by 76.8 meters, covered nearly 174,240 square feet approximately 4 acres, and provided considerably more room to maneuver the larger jet aircraft being introduced to the fleet. The flight deck was armored with 3 inches thickness protection. The 4 elevators were positioned with 3 on the starboard side, numbers 1, 3, and 4 from bow stern, and a single elevator number 2 on the port side at the forward end of the angle deck. The elevators were edged by a retractable fence that could be lowered when the elevator was up. A series of cables aided and supported the elevator during movement. All of the elevators measured 63 by 52 feet 19.2 x 15.8 meters in size. One drawback of Forrestal's flight deck design was the positioning of elevator 2 on the port side. Because the elevator was located at the end of the landing portion of the angled deck and at the end runoff catapults 3 and 4, it was almost always in the raised position, which meant that it was not usable unless the only air operations were launches from bow catapults 1 and 2. Just below the flight deck and U3 level, which housed spaces including ready rooms, catapult and resting gear, berthing, intelligence, and combat information centers, was the hangar deck, which consisted of 3 nearly equal bays encompassing some 75,000 square feet, roughly 2 acres. The forward end of the hangar began at the opening for elevator number 2. The bay accommodated between roughly 28 and 40 aircraft depending upon their size. Each bay was separated by a large fireproof and blast-proof door, and elevator openings were sealed with heavy retractable doors. The hangar bay was used for aircraft storage, but more so for aircraft repairs, including removing engine 16 and more complex maintenance. Workstations were positioned around the hangar bay to facilitate repair work. To maximize space, extra fuel tanks and other supplies were often hung from the hangar ceiling. Air group personnel operated from a series of squadron-ready rooms, which were located around the ship, usually near the catapults. 2 escalators were used to transport aircrews the 4 stories to and from the flight deck at a rate of 90 feet a minute. The ready rooms were arranged by squadron, and similar types were often located in close proximity to one another. Launch and recovery operations Forrestal and Saratoga featured for steam-powered catapults, to C-11 aft-bound numbers 1 and 2 from starboard to port and to heavy C-7. Catapults at the waist numbers 3 and 4, starboard to port on the port side. The port catapults were canted outward and toward one another, and permitted launches from the angled deck. Because of this positioning, however, they could not be used for simultaneous launch as could the bow catapults. The bow forward catapults measured 249 feet 75.8 meters long and could launch a 73,000 pounds aircraft at 215 miles per hour. Fewest catapults were 211 feet 64.3 meters long and were limited to 70,000 pounds. Ranger and Independence had for C-11 catapults. At the end of catapults 1 and 2 were catapult overruns resembling horns, called Van Velm bridle catchers, which facilitate a bridle system used to launch older aircraft, such as the A for Skyhawk and F for Phantom II. The overruns would catch the bridle after launch, allowing for reuse. The remaining 2 Forrestals as well as the first Kitty 17 Hawk-class carriers were built in this configuration, while America and John F. Kennedy saw a 3rd bridle catcher added for the waist catapult. These were eventually phased out as the bridle launch system was replaced by the wheel-to launch bar system. USS Carl Vinson CVN-70, a Nimitz-class carrier commissioned in 1982, was the last U.S. carrier built with a bridle catcher. The catapults were fired from console locations along the port and starboard catwalks, for catapults 1 and 2, and from a singular location, adjacent to catapults 3 and 4 along the port catwalk. Steam pressure for the catapults was controlled from a pop-up unit positioned between catapults 1 and 2, and 3 and 4. Steam for the catapults was provided by the carrier's boilers at a temperature of 585 degrees and a pressure of 600 psi. This was increased to 1,200 psi on carriers after Forrestal. Behind catapults 1 through 3 were jet blast deflectors JBDs, which were raised at an angle to direct hot exhaust away from the flight deck during launch. The original JBDs were small slotted devices that were vertically steered in the deck such that they were raised, then rotated at 90 degrees toward launching aircraft. These were soon replaced by the larger JBDs UZOD, which are hinged at the forward end and can be raised to a 45-degree angle. The JBD behind Catapult 3 was smaller than those behind Catapults 1 and 2. There was no JBD for Catapult 4, as the exhaust simply went off the carrier deck edge. This was later changed, beginning with America. All Forrestal and Kitty Hawk carriers saw their JBDs enlarged in the 1970s as a part of the modifications to accommodate the F-14s. Carrier landings were accomplished using 6 resting gears staged across landing area of the angled deck. These were later reduced to 4 cables and the barricades reduced from 2 to 1 as the carriers underwent overhaul in the early 1960s. The barricade, at 21 feet 6.4 meters high triple-rigged nylon needles to stop aircraft that could not perform a normal rested recovery, was stored under the flight deck and could be raised in roughly 2 minutes. New for the day, pilots on approach used a mirrored landing system developed by the British in the early 1950s. The system, called Magic Mirror, was originally wheel-mounted and mobile and was usually placed on the starboard side of the flight deck at about elevator number 3. The system was then permanently installed on the port deck edge near the start of Catapult 4. Replacing the handheld paddles and flashlights of yesteryear, Magic Mirror great-lighted pilots in coming aboard ship and was a dramatic improvement in safety. The mirrored system was later replaced by the Fresnel lens visual landing aid system in the early 1960s. It was installed on Forrestal during the September 1961 to January 1962 overhaul. The Fresnel lens system consisted of a set-off reference lights datum lights, a flight path indicator light located between the datum lights, and additional signal lights to give the below a cut signal reduce power and land or wave off signal add power and fly around for another approach. When an aircraft was on its flight path, the flight path indicator light the meatball appeared high with reference to the datum lights. When the aircraft was on its desired flight path, the meatball was perfectly aligned. Approaching aircraft were controlled by the LSO, who called the approach from a small port-side platform LSO platform. The LSO was an experienced aviator who talked to the aircraft on approach and provided slight adjustments, and who also controlled the cut and wave-off lights on their Fresnel lens. LSOs went through a complex school and spent countless years calling aircraft ashore before being permitted to do so at sea. Stora's Forrestal class carried a large quantity of aviation fuel, some 750 gallons. Fuel was dispensed to aircraft at any of 40 receptacles on the flight deck. At first the aviation fuel included a mix of jet fuel and aviation gas, but the latter was discontinued after piston engine aircraft left service in the 1960s. To support the air group, roughly 2,000 t of ammunition was stored in armored magazines, which were accessed from the flight deck via small elevators. The carrier also stored over 7,800 trillion of fuel for the ship. The storerooms on the carrier were the equivalent of a 6-story, 1-block square warehouse, and had a cumulative capacity of 408,325 cubic ft. There were also 257 inflatable lifeboats capable of embarking the entire crew. The inflatable lifeboat was later replaced by a new lifeboat in a pod, which automatically deployed upon striking the water. Defensive systems Forrestals were initially outfitted with 8 Mk-12 single-mount 5 and 38 Calibergans positioned on sponsons, for forward and for aft. The forward guns and sponsons were removed from 3 of the ships at various points during the 1960s because they interfered with ship handling in heavy seas, especially in the North Atlantic. High seas often damaged the guns and sponsons and rendered the guns useless. Ranger retained its sponsons until decommissioning. All remaining aft guns were removed by 1977 and replaced by twin Mk-10 or IM-2 Terrier surface-to-air missile launchers. Each unit had a 40-round rear-loading magazine. Possessing a 218 pounds 99 kilograms controlled fragmentation ward, the IM-2AD was one of the first surface-to-air missiles and was originally deployed with a beam-riding guidance system, having a range of 10 nanometers 11.5 meters. It was upgraded to the IM-2E, which featured semi-active radar homing guidance and had a range of 40 nanometers 46.03 meters. The Terrier system was first replaced by the Standard Missile, and then by the NATO Sea Sparrow Basic Point Defense Missile System BPDMS, which originally included 8 missile Mk-25 launchers, and subsequently Mk-29 launchers. Forrestal carriers were also fitted with at least two Mk-15 phalanx close-in weapons systems CIWS when they underwent service life extension program sleep modifications in the 1980s. CIWS consisted of a 20mm M61 Vulcan Gatling gun mounted on a 19-swivel base. Ammunition was stored in a large white cylinder located above the gun, which subsequently spawned the nickname R2-D2 from the movie Star Wars. SIWS was developed in the 1970s and began appearing on aircraft carriers in the early 1980s when they were in port for scheduled work, beginning with USS Coral Sea in 1980. Most carriers had 3 CIWS units: electronic systems and radar-mast radar, and communications antennas were located on the carrier-land superstructure. This configuration provided much better radar coverage than the layout in the original design, which called for a series of radars to be located around the carrier and merged into one radar picture. Forrestal's radar systems at commissioning were simple by today's standard. Air search was provided by the SPS-8A and SPS-122D radar. Saratoga and Ranger shared this configuration, although Independence, the last of the class, received the newer SPS-8B and SPS-37A-D. These radars were replaced in the early 1960s by the SPS-43A-D and SPS-33D, which assumed the duties of the SPS-8AB and SPS-12. All used the SPN-10 navigation radar. By the mid-1970s, all were operating the SPS-48-3D and SPS-49-D air search radar. Propulsion carrier was powered by 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers and 4 Westinghouse-geared turbine engines, generating 260,000 shaft horsepower. Because Forrestal was built under rather urgent time constraints, the engine machinery was limited in steam conditions to wartime figures of 600 psi and 20,850 degrees of superheat, resulting in the reduced horsepower. These figures were later changed, from Saratoga onward, to reflect standard post-war conditions of 200 psi and 950 degrees, which increased overall power to 280,000 St. Helena pounds at the cost of a minimal increase in weight and resulted in a significant improvement in fuel consumption. The carrier's engines drove for propellers to 5-blade and to 4-blade, each measuring to 1 ton diameter and weighing 45 t. The carrier was capable of a top speed of 33 knots 38 miles per hour. As built, Forrestal possessed 3 rudders, although this practice was discontinued on subsequent carriers. The Forrestal carrier, since it is possible to write an entire book on each carrier's supplements, the following summaries highlight the more significant operational achievements of the various Forrestal class carriers. In all respects, it should be noted that the Forrestal carriers played a vital role in advancing the development of naval aviation and in projection of American power during the height of the Cold War. Named for the first Secretary of Defense and former naval aviator James V. Forrestal, this carrier was authorized on July 12, 1951, and work began on its keel 1 year later at the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dock Company in Newport News, Virginia. Forrestal was launched on December 11, 1954, and commissioned on October 1, 1955, with Captain Al Johnson as its commanding officer. The carrier was originally designated as CVA for attack carrier, but was redesignated as a general-purpose carrier, CV-59, in June 1975, when the carrier incorporated the anti-submarine mission via addition of the S-3 Viking and SH-3 Sea King. Initially homeported at Norfolk, Forrestal spent its first year in intensive training operations off the Virginia Capes and in the Caribbean, familiarizing USS Saratoga with S-3 Viking and S-3 Viking launches from USS Saratoga CVA-60 on a routine anti-submarine patrol. The Viking joined the carrier Air Wing in the mid-1970s and assumed the organic anti-submarine warfare SW role previously undertaken by the SW dedicated modified Essex-class carriers. The Viking was incorporated in the attack Air Wing in the mid-1970s as part of the new CVW concept. The Viking evolved into a formidable surface warfare aircraft and a fleet tanker, and also performed overland surveillance. Due to the aircrews and deck crews with their operations in the larger flight deck, Forrestal made its first deployment to the Mediterranean in January 1957 as part of the 6th Fleet. After making several additional Mediterraneanism over the next few years, in November 1963 it made history by conducting operations with AC-130F cargo transport. Over the course of 3 days, a 3-person crew led by Lt. James H. Flatley III conducted 21 full-stop landings and takeoffs from Bristol. These tests, part of the Navy's efforts to develop a supercod carrier onboard delivery aircraft, marked the largest and heaviest aircraft ever to operate from a carrier deck. At the time, no aircraft had sufficient range to replenish carriers mid-ocean. The E-5,000 pounds 40.5 TC-130F Buno, 149,798 came to a complete stop within 267 feet 81 meters and was able to take off in 745 feet 200. The tests demonstrated that the aircraft could transport 25,000 pounds 11 t of cargo over 2,500 miles for 1,000 kilometers, which clearly met the Navy's needs. However, that program was considered too risky for routine operations and was cancelled. The direct offshoot was the Sea to Greyhound program. In 1967, Forrestal arrived in the Tonkin Gulf and began air operations over North Vietnam on July 23. 4 days later, a Zuni rocket from an F-4 Phantom on deck misfired into a park gate for Skyhawk, breaking open the Skyhawk's 400-gallon external fuel tank and starting a horrendous fire that consumed 21 aircraft, resulted in 134 dead and 161 injured, and caused over $72 million in damage. The carrier sustained over a dozen major detonations from 500 pounds and 1,000 pounds bombs, missiles, and hundreds of gallons of burning jet fuel. Forrestal returned to the United States for repairs, surviving the most damage ever caused to an American aircraft carrier. The carrier returned to duty and made another 4 deployments to the Mediterranean between 1968 and 1975. During this time, the new S-3 Viking conducted carrier qualifications aboard Forrestal. In July 1975, Forrestal participated in a special shock test where high explosives were detonated near the hull to examine how carriers withstood the strain of close-quarter combat. Following a 9-month major overhaul, in September 1977, the Navy changed its home port to Mayport, Florida, and the following year the ship participated in a major NATO exercise, Northern Wedding, which involved practicing the reinforcement and resupply off Europe in the event of war. Forrestal continued to make regular Mediterranean-lism until it entered selected restricted availability in September through November 1990. And underwent modifications to allow it to operate the F-18 Hornet and H-60 Seahawk. As Desert Storm neared, the carrier served as the ready carrier in preparation for deployment to the Persian Gulf. Although it was called up twice, it was never deployed in support of combat operations. The carrier made its 21st and final deployment in May 1991, finishing its career with over 376,500 arrested landings recorded. In early 1990, Forrestal began serving as a training carrier, replacing U.S. Lexington AVT-16. Later that year it entered a 14-month complex overhaul, but in early 1993 the Navy decided to decommission Forrestal and to discontinue a dedicated training carrier. The world's first supercarrier was officially decommissioned on September 11, 1993. Since then, efforts to make it into a museum have failed. Forrestal was stored at Newport, Rhode Island, until October 2013 when it was sold for scrap. CV-60 was the 6th ship and 2nd aircraft carrier to bear the name Saratoga. Named for the Revolutionary War battle, the carrier was commissioned in April 1956 under the command of Captain Robert Joseph Stroh. Built in the New York Navy shipyard, the carrier made its inaugural deployment in 1957 to the North Atlantic, participating in Operation Strikek, a major NATO naval exercise simulating an all-out Soviet attack on Europe. Saratoga made the majority of its deployments to the Mediterranean, but did participate in the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. On June 24, 1969, an F-4 Phantom II crew from VF-103 made the first operational hands-off carrier-arrested landing using the SPN-42 Automatic Carrier Landing System ACLS. In 1972, Saratoga made its only Vietnam deployment, operating on Yankee Station from May 18 through January 7, 1973. During this period, a VF-31 F-4 Phantom crew downed unearthed Vietnamese MiG-21. The carrier thereafter continued to deploy to the Mediterranean on an almost annual basis, and each instance with carrier Air Wing 17 CVW-17. During its 1980 Mediterranean cruise with CVW-17, then commanding Gothiker, Cap James H. Flatley III, made his 1,500th carrier-arrested landing with his son, then a midshipman, in the aft cockpit. Shortly after that cruise, Saratoga entered the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard for what was then the most extensive overhaul ever performed on a Navy ship, a 28-month SLEP. When the carrier departed for sea trials, it was given the new nickname, Super Sarah. Following this sleep, the carrier operated the new F-1 for Tomcat rather than the F-4J. Saratoga was also involved in operations off Libya in 1986, even conducting strikes against Libyan patrol boats, but left the area before the El Dorado Canyon raids. During deployment, Saratoga also provided air cover for interception of the Achille Lauro hijackers. For the carrier deployed in support of Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm in late 1990 and early 1991, with two FA-18Cs from VFA-81 downing Iraqi MiGs on the opening night of the war. The carrier also held the unwanted distinction of being the first to lose a naval aviator to enemy action in the conflict when LTCDR Michael Spiker's FA-18 was lost. The air wing also lost an F-14A from VF-101, although both crew survived. The carrier began its 22nd and final deployment in January 1994, departing with CVW-17 for the Adriatic Sea to support our operations over Bosnia-Herzegovina. Saratoga returned to Mayport and was decommissioned in August 20, 1994. It was towed to Philadelphia Naval Yard the following spring to join the inactive fleet and was subsequently moved to Newport, Rhode Island, where it remains today awaiting disposal. The carrier recorded over 300,000 arrested landings. The second aircraft carrier bearing the name Ranger, CVA-61, was launched from the Newport News shipyards on September 29, 1956. Ranger was the first carrier built from the start as an angled deck carrier. Although initially deployed to the Atlantic Fleet and operating out of Norfolk, Ranger moved to Alameda, California, in August 1959 and remained a Pacific Fleet carrier for the remainder of its career. Most of the carrier's subsequent deployments were Western Pacific Westpac deployments, although some focused more specifically on the Indian Ocean and later the Persian Gulf. In 1963-64, while being overhauled, Ranger had 8 feet to point for 3 meters added to the width of its flight deck to accommodate newer aircraft. In May 1964, while observing the French nuclear detonation at Morro in the Pacific, Ranger launched a U-2 spy plane from its deck. Reported live launch was deemed so secret that the flight deck personnel were sent below deck for the launch. The following year, the carrier made the first off-season deployments to the waters off Vietnam. In 1967, the carrier was the first to deploy with the new A-7 Corsair II, a light bomber designed to replace the for Skyhawk, the DK-3B Skywarrior, and THUH-C Sprite helicopter. In March 1971, Ranger and Kitty Hawk set a record of 233 strike sorties launched in a single day. In 1972, it participated in linebacker to air operations along with Enterprise, Saratoga, Oriskany, and America. The carrier was again in combat during Desert Storm, AVF-1 F-1 for a shot down and Iraqi Mi-8 helicopter. The following year, Ranger participated in the 50th anniversary of the Doolittle raid on Tokyo by launching 2 World War II B-25 Mitchell bombers. During its final deployment, the carrier provided air support for Operation Restore Hope and covered the Army Ranger operations in Somalia. Following completion of its 21st deployment in 1992, Ranger was decommissioned on July 10, 1993, and is currently in storage in Bremerton, Washington. Ranger earned 13 battle stars in Vietnam and was seen in several movies, including Top Gun, Star Trek IV, The Final Countdown, and Flight of the Intruder. Ranger was the only carrier in its class to retain its forward sponsons and not to undergo sleep. The fifth United States ship to carry the name Independence, CVA-62, was built at the New York Naval Shipyard and was launched on June 6, 1958. Captain Y. McElroy was the first commanding officer. Following its shakedown cruise in the Caribbean and suitability trials during 1959, the carrier deployed from Norfolk to the Mediterranean in August 1960. Independence provided air support during the 1960 to Berlin crisis and during the Cuban Missile Crisis and performed air strikes against North Vietnam during 1965. The carrier made numerous Mediterranean deployments during the 1970s and, in early 1980, served there with 3 other U.S. carriers supporting an international peacekeeping force off Lebanon. In 1983, Independence entered Operation Urgent Fury, the liberation of Grenada, and later returned to Lebanon to conduct airstrikes against Syrian positions. Independence underwent a sleep in February 1985 until June 1988, and then relocated to the Pacific Fleet, home porting in San Diego. In 1990, Independence and CVW-14 arrived in the Gulf of Oman to provide air support for Operation Desert Shield following the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Independence was on station for nearly 3 months before returning to port in late December. In September 1991, Independence A and CVW-5 forward deployed to Yokosuka, Japan, replacing USS Midway. The crew remained there until 1998, when it was replaced by USS Kitty Hawk. Independence was decommissioned on September 30, 1998, after 39 years of service. The carrier was heavily stripped to support other active carriers and its port anchor, and both anchor chains were used on USS Georgia W. Bush CVN-77. Independence is stored at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, Bremerton, Washington, and is scheduled to be scrapped. The Kitty Hawk-class Forrestal-class carriers were authorized in 1951 for Shipbuilding Program FY52, which called for the construction of 1 new carrier every year thereafter. Work on Forrestal commenced in July 1952, with Saratoga, Ranger, and Independence following each year. In late 1950, Buships told Seknov that the first true opportunity to consider carrier redesign would come in the FY55 building program CV-62. Buships noted that the need to complete the carriers then under construction on time outweighed need for any type improvements. On the horizon were nuclear propulsion and considerations of costs, which were already growing with the Forrestals. The next Forrestal was estimated at $215 million. As part of this process, Navy planners considered an improved Midway-sized carrier of roughly 44,500 long tons designated CVA-353, an improved version CVA-1053, and a larger CVA design able to handle aircraft of up to 100,000 pounds. These studies confirmed that such alternative carrier designs were possible given the aircraft of the day circa 1953, but that each would soon prove impractical as aircraft grew. As a result, the decision was made to continue with the Forrestal design, or some variation thereof, and to modify the carriers as needed to accommodate the larger aircraft. Given this realization, planners then turned their attention to improvements in aircraft operations, more powerful resting gear, relocating aviaciones and munitions forward, elimination of the centerline rudder, and modifications to the flight deck and waist catapults. Of these proposals, only a few could reasonably be developed in time for inclusion in the FY55 carrier, CVA-62, which meant some of the proposals would have to wait for the next construction. Nevertheless, both FY50 for CVA-61 and FY55 CVA-62 carriers received more powerful waist catapults. Over time, these designs evolved and were given the designation SCB-1-7 and generally applied to the FY56 carrier, ultimately becoming USS Kitty Hawk CVA-63 SCB-1-7A. The next two supercarriers, CVA-6 for Constellation and CVA-66 America, were also in this class. Central to this redesign was rearrangement off carrier flight deck. The island structure was moved aft, Adophone elevator and aft of starboard elevators 1 and 2. Moreover, the port elevator number 4 was moved aft and out of the angled flight deck, which permitted elevator use during recovery operations and launch operations from the waist catapults. This repositioned elevator could then 27 service the waist catapults, while elevators 1 and 2 could service Thebo catapults. Elevator 3, aft of the island, could be used to remove aircraft from the deck after recovery to complement elevator 4 in servicing the waist catapults. In addition to the flight deck rearrangement, the elevators were also enlarged to accommodate the A3 and A5 aircraft. A pie-shaped segment was added to each elevator's outboard edges and became standard on all Kitty Hawk, Enterprise, and Nimitz-class carriers. Major differences from the Forrestal class apart from the rearranged flight deck and enlarged elevators discussed above. The principal differences between the Forrestal class and Kitty Hawk class were largely internal. The first two carriers of the class, CVA-6-3 Kitty Hawk and CVA-6 for Constellation, were largely the same design, although some differences existed, as noted below. USS America CVA-6-6 was an improved Kitty Hawk, and USS John F. Kennedy CVA-6-7 was Atlas on its own, and both were originally planned as nuclear carriers. Defensive armamenton of the most prominent physical differences was the ship defense veerment, which began with the substitution of Terrier missile surface-to-air systems for the previous 5-inch mounts used on the Forrestal class. The two forward guns and sponsons were eliminated, and the aft guns replaced by twin Mk-10 Terrier launchers. These launchers were subsequently removed and replaced by Sea Sparrow's launchers. Terriers were replaced by Sea Sparrows and Kitty Hawk in 1977, and on Constellation and America in 1979-82. All of the carriers were given a third Sea Sparrow launcher by 1990. The three carriers each possessed the RM-2 Terrier missile system, which necessitated installation of THESPG-55 tracking illumination missile guidance radar antennae. The Terrier missiles were later replaced by THE-RM-67B standard and even later by Mk-25 and Mk-29 launchers with RM-7 Sea Sparrows. The latter served as a point missile defense system against low-flying cruise missiles. Fire control was initially provided by the Mk-115 Illuminator and subsequently the Mk-95, which had automatic guidance and could be used in all weather conditions. A third launcher was later added to the Kitty Hawk carriers and located starboard. Additional last-line close-in defense was provided by the Phalanx close-in weapon system SEWS. As with 30 the Forrestal carriers, these were added to Kitty Hawk and its follow-ons in the 1980s during overhauls. Kitty Hawk and Kennedy also received at least one of the new RM-116 rolling airframe missiles rams for Mk-36 Super RBOC rapid blooming off-board chaff infrared decoys, and towed SLQ-25 Nixie torpedo decoys. CVA-67, USS John F. Kennedy, Terrier launchers, was built with no guns or heavy missile batteries. Rather, provisions were made for installation at a later date of three new short-range basic point defense missile systems Sea Sparrow or BPDMS, which were added in 1967. As an interesting note, during the mid to late 1950s, three of the Forrestal-class carriers were planned to carry the nuclear-armed turbojet-powered cruise missile, the SSMN-8A Regulus. Of these three, only Saratoga actually launched at a Regulus. This capability was removed once the 3D Skywarrior and A4 Skyhawk attack aircraft, which were nuclear strike capable, were deployed in large numbers. Dimensions and displacement. Early Kitty Hawk carriers had a standard displacement of 60,100 t, with a deep load displacement of 80,800 t. Fully loaded, the early Kitty Hawks had a deep draft just 15 inches less than the Forrestals. From a flight depth perspective, Kitty Hawk measured 1,060 feet 6 inches 323.8 meters, while Constellation was 10th longer. Both had a 249 feet 75.8 meters wide flight deck and measured 129 feet 6 inches 39.5 meters abeam. Propulsion. Owing to improvements in technology, Kitty Hawk, Constellation, and America featured a larger power plant, 280,000 St. Helena pounds, which supported 200 psi, and in turn improved catapult performance. Given the larger power plant, these carriers could reach a top speed of 35 knots 40.27 miles per hour. Recognizing the need for more fuel to support our operations and the need for more fuel for newer jets, the Kitty Hawk class carriers carried 1,900,000 gallons of aviation fuel, more than twice that of Forrestal's. Electronics and radar. Sturgeonal radar suite for first to Kitty Hawk carriers comprised the SPS-37 Air Search, SPS-39 3D Air Search, SPS-8 Height Finding Radar, and SPS-55 Missile Evidence Radar. For the Terriers, America, discussed below, had THE-SPS-43 VHF Long Range Air Search Radar and the SPS-50 to 3D Long Range Air Search Radar. Antenna on the island. The SPS-43 to D radar had a range of over 300 miles and provided bearing and distance information, while the SPS-5 to 3D radar could provide contact bearing, range, and altitude. The SPS-5 to could be mechanically rotated for azimuth, but used electronic scanning for elevation. The two radars would work together, with the SPS-43 picking up the contact at distance and the SPS-52 providing details as the contact approached. An SPS-30 surface search radar antenna was located on the new latticework mast aft of the main mast. Each ship was also fitted with TC and tactical airborne navigation aids. John F. Kennedy carried a smaller Sudioff SPS-43A and the new SPS-48 3D long-range air search radar. America's SPS-52 was replaced with the more capable SPS-48 radar in 1982, and all ships in the class saw their SPS-43A replaced with the SPS-49 during 1979-80. USS America CVA-66 improved Kitty Hawk final carrier of the class. USS America was similar to its two sisters and, due to the time between the construction of CVA-63 FY-56 and 64 FY-57, and America FY-61 in part because of the construction of Enterprise, was sometimes considered an improved Kitty Hawk. The carrier was the first to feature the bulbous bow-mounted SQS-23 sonar. The sonar was included to help combat the quieter Soviet nuclear submarines then being fielded. To ensure the anchors did not interfere with the sonar, a modification was made, adding a small beak on the bow. While America had two anchors, the port anchor was moved to the center of the bow stem, where the beak moved it forward and prevented it from contacting the sonar bulb. America was also fitted with a narrower smokestack, which reduced turbulence and kept exhaust gases away from the flight deck. The slant superstructure configuration was also altered, moving the flight from the east end of the island to atop the navigation bridge on the front of the island. America was a slightly smaller carrier than Kitty Hawk and Constellation, measuring 1,047 feet 6 and 319.3 meters in length, but possessed a wider hull than its two predecessors, measuring 130 feet 39.6 meters. As a final physical difference, America featured smooth or rounded sponsons versus the boxier ones in earlier Forrestal and Kitty Hawk designs. This provided a more stable transit, especially in rough waters. USS John F. Kennedy, CVA-67, a singular class. Although sometimes referred to as a member of the Kitty Hawk class, USS John F. Kennedy was an improved Kitty Hawk and is considered to have been a single-ship class. As late as 1963, the carrier was planned as nuclear-powered, but was reconfigured as a conventional carrier for cost reasons. Based on America, the Kennedy had many modifications that made it unique. For example, the flight deck had numerous revised contours that resembled those found on subsequent Nimitz-class carriers, and the smokestack was canted outward to help direct gases and smoke away from the flight deck. Moreover, while losing the CVA-66 hull as a starting point, Kennedy incorporated several of the protective armor features from Enterprise. Although the carrier was provisioned fourth bow-mounted SQS-23 sonar, as was America, it was never installed. Kennedy's flight deck was 3 feet wider at 250 feet or 76.8 meters than the Priest and Kitty Hawk carriers, but had a standard displacement of only 61,000 trillion and a deep low displacement of 87,000 t. The overall length was 1,070 feet 326.7 meters, and the hull beam was 130 feet 39.6 meters. The carrier stored more jet fuel and more ammunition than prior carriers, and all squadron-ready rooms were moved to the 3-level galley deck, eliminating the need for the escalators. Kennedy featured 3 C-13 catapults numbers 1, 2, and 4, which had a run of 250 feet 76.2 meters. Catapult 3 was a more powerful C-13 Mod 1 catapult, measuring 310 feet 94.4 meters and enabling launch of the heaviest aircraft even at anchor with no wind over deck. As with America, Catapult 4 had a smaller one-piece JBD. From a superstructure standpoint, the island, apart from the canted smokestack, resembled that of America, with the flag bridge on 08 level, navigation bridge on 09 level, and pry-fly on 10 level. Although consideration was given to installing the proposed but cancelled RIM-50 Typhoon LR and then the less capable RIM-2 for Tartar surface-to-air missile, Kennedy was commissioned without any weapons. However, in 1967 3 BPM-DSC Sparrow systems were added. One 8-missile Mk-25 launcher was located near the starboard bow and one was positioned on each of the aft quarters. 3 Mk-15 CIWS were also installed during the 1980s, one on Kennedy's port bow quarter, a second on the starboard island, and a third on the aft stern quarter. As with the other carriers in the Forrestal and Kitty Hawk classes, several Mk-36 Rapid Bloom off-board chaff support RBOC launchers were positioned around the carrier for defense against radar guide D missiles. A second Kennedy-class carrier was considered in the late 1970s as a more affordable alternative to the increasingly expensive Nimitz-class constructions. At that time, a new Kennedy was evaluated versus a fourth Nimitz recently defunded, and also a new design called Aircraft Carrier Medium or CVV. This design, at 52,200 trillion, was 912 feet 278 meters long and 126 feet 38.2 meters abeam, featured two catapults and two elevators, and called operate between 55 and 65 vertical short takeoff and landing stole USS America. America featured a modified island structure and a bulbous bow section to accommodate a Neusener system, but was otherwise similar in construction to its sisters Kitty Hawk and Constellation Convencio. Naval aircraft. Both CVV and another Kennedy were rejected by the Carter administration in favor of USS Theodore Roosevelt CVN-71. The Kitty Hawk and John F. Kennedy carriers. As with the summary on the Forrestal class, the following highlights the significant contributions made by each Kitty Hawk class carrier during the Cold War and beyond. And like the Forrestals, which were all retired within a few years of the end of the Cold War, Kitty Hawk and the improved Kitty Hawk class carriers continued to make tremendous contributions to American foreign policy throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. The namesake of the improved Forrestal class carriers, Kitty Hawk was named in honor of the location of the Wright brothers' first flight in 1903. Kitty Hawk held the distinction of being the first of its class launched and last retired. Built in New York, the carrier was launched in May 1960 and joined the fleet in April 1961, with Captain William F. Bringle in command. Kitty Hawk did its shakedown cruise in the Atlantic and then performed an around the Horn cruise to its new home port in San Francisco. The carrier made several Westpac deployments and returned to the yard for an 8-month overhaul, before heading to Vietnam in mid-1960 for the first of what would be 7 Vietnam deployments. Kitty Hawk flew strikes as part of Rolling Thunder 1965-68 and Linebacker in 1972. The career entered dry dock in January 1973, and during this period received its first conversion modifications to become a multi-purpose carrier CV, which meant it would be able to operate anti-submarine aircraft as part of its air wing. These modifications included 10 helicopter calibrating stations, sonar sonobuoy redoubt and analysis center, and an anti-submarine classification and analysis center ASCAC in the carrier's Combat Information Center CIC. These changes were completed during the carrier's complex overhaul in 1976, which enabled it to operate the S-3 Viking. Other modifications to the catapults and JBD enabled operation of the new F-14. In March 1984, while participating in a Team Spirit exercise off Japan, the carrier was damaged when a Soviet Victor-class nuclear submarine, K-314, surfaced directly beneath it. The carrier continued to undertake Pacific deployments and was involved in operation and during Freedom Air strikes following the 9/11 attacks on New York and the Pentagon. Kitty Hawk served as the forward deployed carrier from 1998 until September 2008. When it was replaced by USS George Washington CVN-73. CVW-5, which has long been associated with the forward deployed carrier, shifted to George Washington. Kitty Hawk ended an early 48-year career as the last conventionally powered carrier in the fleet. It was decommissioned on May 12, 2009, and is in inactive storage at Bremerton, to be held in reserve until 2015. Ordered on July 1, 1956, Constellation was the last aircraft carrier constructed in the New York Naval Shipyard. A fire during construction delayed the construction by some 7 months and cost an additional $75 million. Constellation was launched in October 1960 and commissioned a year later, with Cap T.J. Walker as commanding officer. The carrier underwent its initial sea trials and training off the Virginia coast, and then steamed around the Horn off South America to take up residence in the Pacific Fleet in the summer of 1962. On its second deployment, Constellation found itself in the Tonkin Gulf when hostilities broke out in August 1964. This marked the first of 6 Vietnam deployments, which saw the carrier and its air wing claim 11 North Vietnamese MiGs in aerial combat, including those by the Navy's only asses of the Vietnam War, Lt. Randall Cunningham and Lt. Junior Grade Willie Driscoll, in May 1972. During Constellation's 1968 deployment, the carrier spent 128 days on the line, and its air wing flew over 11,000 combat and support sorties, dropping nearly 20,000 t of ordnance. During the carrier's 1970 deployment, an F for Phantom crew claimed the first MiG kill since the end of Rolling Thunder operations in late 1968, and demonstrated the value of the Navy's recently formed Fighter Weapons School Top Gun. Constellation underwent its second overhaul from February 1970 to April 1976, at which time it converted to the CV standards to operate Tomcats and Vikings. Constellation began sleep in February 1990, lasting until March 1993, and went on to participate in several Operation Southern Watch deployments and Operation Enduring Freedom. In the latter operations, the carrier's air wing flew 1,500 sorties and dropped over 1.7 million pounds of ordnance against Taliban forces. The carrier also participated in the making of the movie Pearl Harbor during the Doolittle raid launch-ins. At the conclusion of its 21st deployment in 2003, the carrier ended 41 years of service. On April 17, an S-3B Viking recorded the carrier's 395,710th and final arrested landing. Constellation was replaced by U.S. Ronald Reagan CVN-76. It remains in storage in Bremerton awaiting dismantling or sinking. The last of the Kitty Hawk class, USS America was first ordered as a nuclear-powered carrier part of the Enterprise class. Then-66 but was changed to a conventional carrier before construction began. Launched in February 1964, the carrier was commissioned in January 1965 under the command of Capt. Lawrence Hayworth Jr. America was the subject of an aggressive naming campaign, which saw efforts to name it USS Congress, Constitution, Alliance, Langley, and Williamsburg. America spent 1965 in shakedown cruise and workups in the Atlantic and was home-ported in Norfolk. The carrier made several Mediterranean cruises before deploying to Vietnam in March 1968. In for-line periods over 112 days, the carrier flew strikes against North Vietnam and, in July, an F for J from the F-33 CVW-6 down to MiG-21. In November 1969, America USS John F. Kennedy Big John was originally intended to be a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier but was redesigned as a conventionally powered carrier after the high costs of USS Enterprise CVN-65. While the flight deck was arranged somewhat differently than prior Kitty Hawk-class carriers, the most noticeable feature of the John F. Kennedy was the canted smokestack on the island. Participated in carrier suitability tests for Thelic U-2R before making its second Vietnam deployment in 1970. During that deployment, an A-70 from VA-146 made the type's combat debut. The carrier was on station for 5 line periods and during that time embarked CVW-9, flew 10,600 sorties to 1,626 of which were combat sorties, made 10,800 for carrier landings, and delivered 11,900 t of ordnance. America made a third Vietnam deployment in 1972. Following several more Mediterraneanism during the 1970s, the carrier deployed off Libya in April 1986 in support of Operational Dorado Canyon. Carrier aircraft from America, along with USS Coral Sea, Struxam and Auschwitz, suppressing enemy air defenses for other strike aircraft, including the U.S. Air Force F-111s that had launched from bases in England. In 1990-91, America supported Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. America and its air wing, CVW-1, joined carriers Saratoga and John F. Kennedy in launching strikes from the Red Sea. Later in the conflict, America moved into the Persian Gulf and became the 4th carrier in battle for Sulu, supporting strikes in Kuwait. America was the sole carrier to operate on both sides of the Arabian Peninsula during the war. CVW-1 flew 3,008 combat sorties and dropped over 2,000 t of ordnance, destroying over 380 armored vehicles and tanks. After the war, the carrier made 2 Mediterranean deployments, with its 20th and final deployment including support of Southern Watch in the Persian Gulf and Operations Denied Flight and Deliberate Force in the Adriatic. Although scheduled to undergo SLEP in 1996 to extend its service until 2010, budgetary constraints forced the Navy to cancel few work and to retire the carrier after only 30 years of service. Following decommissions in August 1996, the carrier was transferred to the reserve fleet, and in May 2005 was sunk during explosive tests some 250 miles southeast of Cape Hatteras. America's exact resting spot is 33909N, 71st 3907W. The carrier is reported to be sitting upright in only peace in 16,860 feet 5,140 meters of ocean. Originally planned as a nuclear carrier, John F. Kennedy was ordered as a conventional carrier and was the last built as such. The carrier was named after President John F. Kennedy following his assassination in 1963 and was christened in 1967 by his then 9-year-old daughter Caroline. The carrier was commissioned in September 1968. Kennedy was home-ported in Norfolk and made several deployments to the Mediterranean. Big John was the last carrier to operate the piston-engine Skyraider, in this instance, the A1F version. The carrier was modified as a general-purpose carrier, CV, in the early 1970s, and continued to serve the 6th Fleet throughout the 1980s. In 1989, to VF-3 to F-14S from Kennedy's Air Wing, CVW-3 shot down to Libyan MiG-23 floggers that had threatened F battle group operating in the Mediterranean. Kennedy and CVW-3 supported Operation Desert Storm and served as the flagship of the Red Sea Battle Force. Kennedy was the last carrier to operate the 70 Corsair in combat. During the war, the carrier's air wing flew 2,895 sorties and 11,263 combat flight hours and 114 strikes, delivering over 3.5 million. Following the carrier's return from Desert Storm, it underwent modifications to accommodate the FA-18, which replaced the 70 Corsair in the air wing. After this work, it made a single Mediterranean cruise wherein Aviator sledged the carrier's 250,000th arrested landing on December 8, 1992. The carrier returned from deployment and underwent a 2-year comprehensive overhaul. In September 1995, it headed to Mayport to serve as the Navy's reserve operational carrier. Kennedy made several deployments to the Mediterranean and in 2002 participated in enduring freedom operations over Afghanistan. In the course of 2,599 missions, the carrier's air wing delivered over 64,000 pounds of ordnance. Upon returning to the United States, the carrier conducted workups and carrier qualifications for several reservine training squadrons, then entered a 9-month overhaul in early 2003. On its final deployment, Kennedy and CVW-17 supported Iraqi freedom, flying 8,296 sorties for a total flight time of 21,824 hours. Of these, 4,396 sorties and 11,607 flight hours were in direct support of operations. Due to rising operational and maintenance costs, in April 2005 the Navy canceled the carrier's scheduled 15-month overhaul and announced its retirement. After several final port stops, including Boston, the carrier was decommissioned in Mayport on March 23, 2007. Kennedy was initially stored at Norfolk and is now in Philadelphia as part of Reserve Fleet. The namesake will continue as part of the Gerald Ford carrier class. CVN-79 has been named PCU John F. Kennedy and is expected to be commissioned in 2022. For the Enterprise class, discussions of nuclear-powered aircraft carriers date back to as early as 1946, during design of United States. In fact, while it was assumed that nuclear power would not be ready for the early designs, plans called for introducing nuclear propulsion later in the class construction. The Navy did not seriously undertake studies into nuclear power plants until the early 1950s, and then only in land-based prototypes. In November 1951, the Joint Chiefs of Staff established a formal requirement for a carrier reactor. At that time, the only studies underway focused on nuclear power plants for the submarines, which were very different from units needed for large surface vessels. Thus, the idea of simply upscaling the submarine design was not feasible. In 1954, a research and development program began with the goal of developing 5 reactor prototypes, including one for aircraft carriers. By the mid-1950s, however, reactor technology had advanced sufficiently for construction of a nuclear-powered carrier. Thus, in FY58, Following the authorization of 6 Forrestal conventional carriers, funds were allocated for construction of the first nuclear-powered carrier, USS Enterprise CVN-65. However, the carrier was exceedingly expensive, costing nearly $500 million in $1,961. Moreover, construction of Enterprise took longer than conventional carriers, which conflicted with the Navy's 1 carrier per year plan toward a goal of 15 carriers. Given the expenses associated with nuclear power and the construction of Enterprise, the 2 additional carriers that had originally been planned as nuclear carriers, FY-61 CVN-66 and FY-63 CVN-67, were redesigned as conventional carriers. 6 Enterprise-class carriers were originally planned. Other names considered for the class included Constitution and Congress. Propulsion Enterprise was powered by 8 Westinghouse AW2 reactors, each providing 35,000 St. Helena pounds, for a total of 280,000 St. Helena pounds. Each shaft turned a 64,500 pounds 30.5 trillion, 5-blade propeller, and 4 rudders were included, 1 aft of each propeller. The latter made Enterprise highly maneuverable. Enterprise was capable of at least 33 knots 37.97 miles per hour and, because of the amount of energy generated by the reactors, could steam indefinitely. When nuclear power was conceived, one of the assumed benefits was the ability to travel great distance without the need to refuel the carrier. This was indeed confirmed in 1964 by the now famous World Cruise Operation Sea Orbit of the Nuclear Task Force of the carrier Enterprise, nuclear cruiser USS Long Beach CGN-9. USS America with a 6E Intruder and a 7E Corsair in a 7E Corsair to right and an A6E Intruder, left ready for launch from catapults 1 and 2 aboard USS America CVA-66 in 1982. The Corsair 2 served as their wings light bomber while the A6E served as the medium bomber. The Corsair 2 was phased out in May 1991 and the Intruder retired in 1997. Both aircraft, which served well during the Vietnam War, were replaced by the F-18 Hornet 42 and nuclear destroyer US Bainbridge DLG-25. But a secondary benefit of nuclear power was the enormous amount of electricity and steam generated by the reactors, which could be used to power the latest electronics and steam catapults without degrading carrier performance. The original uranium cores powered Enterprise for 200,000 miles and were replaced in 1965. Another set of cores, albeit newly designed, were installed during 1969-71 after the carrier had steamed another 300,000 miles. These cores contained enough fuel to power the carrier for the next decade. Additional refueling occurred during complex overhauls in 1981-82 and 1990-91, and at roughly 10-year interval Schrieffer. The original cores cost over $4 million, but the replacement cores cost less than $3,500,000. Storrs Enterprise carried considerably more aviation fuel, roughly 2,800 gallons, which allowed it to operate a larger air wing and for a long period of time. Even though the carrier was nuclear, which meant it did not need fuel for its engines, it nonetheless needed liquid as part of its hull protection system. Enterprise filled these spaces with additional jet fuel and also fuel for its escorts. To provide a reference point as to the size of the carrier, its distilling plants possessed a daily capacity of 280,000 gallons of water, roughly enough to supply the daily needs of over 1,400 homes. Flight deck and island Enterprise's flight deck arrangement was similar to that of the Kitty Hawk class. Enterprise was a huge ship, measuring 1,123 feet 342.2 meters in length and displacing some 72,500 t. This larger hull, needed to accommodate the reactors, also resulted in a larger flight deck measuring 1,079 feet 328.8 meters by 235.3 feet 71.7 meters, and 720 feet 219.4 meters for the angled deck. The island structure, however, was much smaller than on earlier supercarriers because it was no longer necessary to have a smokestacks. In contrast to Forrestal and Kitty Hawk, Enterprise had a smaller, square-shaped island structure owing to its innovative flat panel electronically for 3 scanned radars, which were installed on the foreface of the island. The carrier featured the horizontal shape SPS-32 air surveillance search and vertical shape target tracking SPS-33 3D radar, which were referred to as the billboard. An SPS-12 2D search radar was also added to the mast shortly after the carrier was launched because of reliability problems with larger phased array set and as a backup. The land was topped with a turbine-like rotating ECM radar that gave the carrier a futuristic appearance. This configuration provided the carrier with 360-degree 3D radar coverage with a greater scanning rate than conventional radars, and enabled detection at greater ranges. The flag bridge was located just over the billboard radar with the navigation bridge above, stretching around the island structure. A smaller pry-fly was located above the navigation bridge and extended over the edge of the island above the flight deck. Assured mast set on top of the turbine, containing various communications antenna, navigation radar, and the taken. Provisions were also included for and a satellite navigation system. A series of 14 whip antennae were situated around the edge of the flight deck, which could be lowered horizontal and out of the way for operations. Defensive armament also provision for missile batteries. The Enterprise was commissioned without any armament, instead relying on its air wing and escorts. In 1967, however, two Mk-25A Tube C Sparrow launchers were installed on sponsons along with their PQ-7 to fire control radars. In 1968, the SPS-12 air search radar was added to this configuration. During Enterprise refueling and refit from 1991 until 1994, three Mk-15 phalanx mounts were installed. The bridge was also reconstructed and SPS-48C, SPS-49, and SPS-65C Sparrow search radars replaced the earlier radars. Mk-23 target acquisition radar and the SPN-41 landing aid and two SPN-46 air traffic control radars were also added. In the 2000s, two IM-116 rolling airframe missile ram systems were added, each using the Mk-49 guided missile launching system GMLS, which consists of the Mk-144 guided missile launcher GML unit and 21 stores for mount. The world's first nuclear-powered carrier. Enterprise continued the tradition of the venerable World War II-era USS Enterprise, CV-6, and was the 8th naval vessel to bear the name. The carrier was commissioned on November 25, 1961, with Cap Vincent P. Depoy as its commanding officer. The carrier began with a lengthy shakedown cruise in early 1962, which included serving as a tracking and measuring station for the flight offering Ship 7, America's first orbital spacecraft. The carrier performed so well during its 6-day builder's trials that the Navy immediately accepted it. Enterprise joined the Atlantic Fleet, being based in Norfolk, and served there until 1965. In that time it participated in the blockade of Cuba during 1960 to missile crisis as part of Task Force 135 along with 4 other U.S. carriers, including Independence. Immediately following the missile crisis, Enterprise participated in catapult launch tests with an E-2A Hawk and A-6A Intruder to evaluate the new nose-wheel launch bar system, which eventually replaced the bridle system. Enterprise made 2 subsequent deployments to the Mediterranean, and in the latter cruise participated in Operation Sea Orbit, the world's first nuclear-powered world cruise. By October 1964, Enterprise was ready for its first refueling and overhaul. In November 1965, the carrier transferred to the Pacific Fleet, where it made 2 deployments to Vietnam from 1965 through 1967. Its December 2nd deployment marked the first use of a nuclear-powered carrier in combat. Indeed, on December 3rd, the carrier set a record of 165 strike sorties in a single day. In January 1969, the carrier suffered a devastating fire when, similar to a Forrestal, a Zuni rocket pod cooked off due to overheating, starting fires in the deck. In the end, the fire destroyed 15 aircraft and killed 25 crew members, injuring another 314. Repairs were undertaken at Pearl Harbor, lasting into March, and the carrier resumed its deployment to Vietnam. By war's end, Enterprise had made 6 Vietnam deployments, including operations in support of Linebacker I and Linebacker II. In early 1973, Enterprise underwent modifications to allow operation of the new F-1 for Tomcat, which saw 2 of the 4 JBDs enlarged. In March